speaker, Ian Hundley. Ian is a committee member of the Public Transport Users Association and a Borondara community activist with a strong background in the public transport advocacy area, who is going to speak to us this afternoon on transport issues in the Frankston area. So, you're right here. So thanks very much, Ian.
Thanks very much, Kelvin. I've been quite active in the public transport space for 10 or so years, I suppose, and in transport policy issues generally. I was involved in the campaign against the Peninsula Link, which was built by the previous government. It was opened, I think, early last year. And I got a better understanding then, I think, of the environment in which the local community has to operate as far as training, as far as transport deficits are concerned. I'm also very much involved in the public transport not traffic campaign at the moment, which is targeting the East-West Link as basically a project that needs to be dispensed with so we can actually deploy resources into the public transport and active transport space. I've also been active in relation to planning policy issues in Melbourne as well. Today I'm here to discuss some of the things that are going on and what needs to be done to improve the public transport outlook in the Frankston area. What we'll find, I think, is that there are both local and larger issues that have major consequence for Frankston, and I'll attempt to address some of them in the time available. And they do raise issues of economy, ecology and social connectedness. But the influences that local people are able to bring to bear will be very important on how things pan out. So firstly, how do people use public transport in Frankston and the rest of Melbourne? In Frankston and on the peninsula, about 80% of all the trips to work every day, for example.
Excuse me, Aaron, there's a couple of people out the back are indicating they've got a bit of difficulty hearing you.
Oh, okay. I'll shout.
A bit closer to the microphone.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin. So a very large proportion of all the trips to work in this area are actually taken by car rather than by public transport. For Frankston residents, about 5.5% of trips involve public transport, and on the peninsula only about 3.2% of trips, less than 1 in 30. Where public transport is of higher quality, however, like the City of Yarra, about 30% of all trips to work are taken by P2. It's interesting to look at where Frankston residents actually work to get an idea of what's going on. And it's typical for most people who live in the greater metropolitan area to actually work in the local government area in which they live or in relatively close proximity. Of the 60,000 Frankston residents who travel to work every day, about 63% of Frankston people either work in the Frankston area itself or in the adjoining municipalities such as Greater Dandenong or Kingston. Only about 5.5% of Frankston residents actually go to work in Melbourne every day, and a large proportion of those that do so by train. Based on the most recent census, about 340 people in Frankston go to the far-flung destinations that might be assisted by the proposed East-West Link project of the Mount government. So that's about 0.6% of everyone that goes to work from Frankston every day would be assisted potentially by the East-West Link, about 1 in 150. These are people that might go to places like Moonee Valley and Hobson's Bay. There are not many of them. Interestingly, if you look at the data for even municipalities that are closer in to the centre of Melbourne on the eastern side of Melbourne, such as Burundara and Whitehorse, you'll find that the proportion of those residents that actually go across town to the west or the north to work every day is relatively low. This confirms the sort of observations of people that have been campaigning for things like Doncaster Rail as an important thing to take pressure off the Eastern Freeway. As far as public transport within Frankston and the Mornington Peninsula is concerned and its quality, one measure of the quality of the bus network is the number of train patrons that rely on connecting buses from Frankston to go to train destinations. only 1 in 5 of train passengers connected by bus at Frankston Station in the latest data available, which is from 2012. About 45% turned up at the station by car. By contrast, at Box Hill, which is much better served by public transport connecting buses in particular, and also tram, about 28% of train travellers connected by bus, and 43% walk to the station. Only about 1 in 6, about 16 or 17% actually travel by car. It's a very significant difference to what's going on here. So it's the network capacity of the public transport system overall to be able to connect that's really important. The local bus network around Box Hill is much better. And it has to be frequent and to be timetabled to provide good intermodal connections. There is nothing worse than turning up to see the train disappear as you jump off your bus. And that happens a lot in Melbourne, if you have a bus. Poor frequency of service is a major issue for Frankston and the Peninsula. I cite quite often as an example the 788 bus service that goes from Frankston Station to Portsea basically, and only runs every 45 minutes on weekdays and every 75 minutes on average over the weekends. So who is going to use a service of that quality? Very few people, one would think. One would be forgiven for thinking the government's actually trying to put the service out of business. But it's interesting that even despite the fact that it's such a low quality service, that it's one of the most heavily patronised services in the whole of the metro area. We've got about 300 bus services across the metro. And that, last time I looked, that ranked as about number 6 or number 7 in terms of annual patronage, which is absolutely extraordinary. The takeaway message there is that basically there's a crying need for much more frequent services. Another really entertaining service is the 787 route bus service from Sorrento to Safety Beach, which runs disjointedly on weekdays and twice on Saturdays. If you travel from Rye, for example, to Rosebud Plaza to do some shopping during the week, you can spend up to an hour and a half waiting for the return service back home. And this is quite characteristic of what's going on. Frankston gained very little from the timetable and network changes that were introduced last Sunday. There was some improved coordination with late night train services, which is good, but there was no increase at all in frequency of service and service span, which is really what we need. We all need to bring significant pressure to bear on the major parties to commit to upgrading these local bus services in the lead up to the state election on the 29th of November. I just mentioned in passing we also have one train service that goes beyond Frankston, that's the Stony Point line, which has had a pretty checkered history. The previous government tried to close it down. There was community resistance to that. My prediction would be that a future government will try to close it down as well, unless people basically get out and defend it and campaign for increased frequency of service. Now, a frequency of service during weekdays of once every 2 hours just doesn't cut the mustard. And that's what we've got here. I mean, it's a 7-day-a-week service, but it runs every 2 hours during the middle of the day, and it could be upgraded relatively easily with a couple of passing loops that operate and a couple more vehicles. Turn now to the issue of social needs and mobility, which is very, very key to consideration of public transport issues. A report by Belinda Robson for Crossroads Youth and Family Services at the Salvation Army a few years ago, and based on residents in Craigieburn and Roxburgh Park to the north of Melbourne, highlighted the importance of public transport for social connectedness. Summary findings of the report showed that the cost of travel as well as the practical issues with transport meant that many young people were not able to participate in different activities, and many new households at risk with mortgage stress and many face problems juggling financial demands. However, a very high value was placed on their new stations at Roxburgh Park and Craigieburn. And the observation there is that these findings are directly translatable to the Peninsula and Frankston, where residents face exactly the same problems. To talk briefly about the household transport cost burden in relation to what public transport you have available. In the city of Melbourne, for example, only 30% of households have 2 or more cars. In the Shire-Morning Peninsula, about 3/4 of households have 2 or more cars. It's not because people particularly like collecting cars. A large proportion of this difference may be attributed to the relative ease with which urban inner urban residents can travel by PT. Cars are expensive things to run according to the RACV, perhaps $8,000 to $10,000 per year in annualised costs for a relatively small car. A full year Myki will cost you $2,210 per year. So that basically gives you unlimited travel. But who's going to buy a Myki when you basically have to walk a couple of kilometres to the nearest bus and the next one's sort of an hour away? The welfare impact of a lack of access to reasonable PT is shown in sharper relief when one examines family household income. In the city of Melbourne, only 27% of households have a weekly income of less than $1,000. In Roseville, it's about 42%. Thus, lower income households in the periphery of Melbourne are basically compelled to incur substantial additional transport costs. I mentioned Peninsula Link before, which was a fight that was fought well but lost unfortunately. A number of you here today were involved in that campaign, I believe. The project precipitated enormous environmental losses, most conspicuously at locations such as the Pines Flora and Fauna Reserve. Thank you. Thank you. In Westerfield and Langwarrin. The project cost about $750 million. No serious attempt was made to assess any alternative approach, including improving PT services, to take cars off roads. The project was later criticised by the Auditor General in relation to the overstatement of potential economic benefits and the dismissal of long-term negative effects, including inducing more traffic into Frankston and onto the peninsula. The only positive employment effect that I could see in official propaganda had been the trumpeting of the opening of a new roadhouse on the Peninsula Reservation. Now, one of the knock-on effects from the Peninsula Link is the Vic Roads Point and Pier road study. And getting back to this issue of increased traffic being sucked into the area, basically by the provision of more freeways. What Vic Roads is now doing is looking at actually increasing road capacity further into the peninsula. If you look at the Melways, you'll see that there's been a reservation there for years, but governments of various persuasions have been getting rid of rail reservations for years, so I think it's about time we should seriously look at getting rid of freeway reservations as well. I rang Vic Roads when the project got underway and I said, well, I had a look at their terms of reference. And basically what they were doing was doing traffic counts and saying, well, the traffic's going up, we need more road capacity. I said, why don't you actually broaden your terms of reference to actually look at mode shift to public transport? What a good idea, they said. When you read the report, you'll find that they did no such thing. And I know people on the peninsula. I actually made submissions along those lines. And I see that the Southern Peninsula Indigenous Flora and Fauna Association has concluded that if the proposed freeway goes ahead down there, as contemplated in the report which came out last June, it would damage the biodiversity values of the Tookaroo swamp and would have negative hydrological impacts on the swamp itself. Now, the big project that we've all heard of is the East-West Link. According to Dennis Napthine, the East-West Link is supposed to solve all our problems with the possible exception of the common cold. The reality is, however, that there would be nothing left for the timely introduction of necessary transport projects in Frankston or anywhere else if this project goes ahead. It's estimated to cost up to $20 billion, the two parts of it. In September, the Premier and the Treasurer, Michael O'Brien, announced the three shortlisted bidders for the project: East-West Connect, Inner Link Group and Momentum Infrastructure. However, in June this year, the Momentum Group had evidently lost sufficient momentum when the Treasurer reappeared, this time with the Roads Minister, to announce that only the East-West and the Inner Link groups remained. What was not made clear by the two ministers, but was subsequently reported in the press, is that the Momentum Group gave up on the project, reportedly because they found the project to be too risky for them and there were unacceptable geotechnical risks. This raises serious questions about the bona fides of the bid process. Robust tender processes rely on the presence of a substantial number of genuine and able bidders. What we have here is a classical case of monopolistic competition, limited sellers of a product. We've just got two of them. What is worth the final shape of the product remains unclear. and is backgrounded by a business case that remains undisclosed by the government. This is extraordinarily fertile ground for plumbing of the public purse. I had my own experience of government secrecy on the project when I wrote to the Minister for Roads and asked for the traffic volume data on CityLink and EastLink in the process of preparing a submission to the CIS process earlier this year. The Minister wrote back and said, quote, "The terms of the contractual arrangements between the state and the toll road operators prohibit the state from disclosing confidential or unpublished information without the consent of the relevant road operator." And he concluded by saying the road operator had refused access to the data. So that means members of the public are not able to find out how many cars and trucks are actually going down toll roads in Melbourne, period. Not allowed. It's not permitted in the contracts if the toll road operators say no, which they did in this case. It's a complete outrage. Just prior to Leighton's declaration that the project was not for it, the Sunday Age reported that the Napthine government will use the East-West Link and the other major projects to leverage donations from big business as it builds up a war chest for this year's state election. That pretty much closes the circle. The Napthine government is determined to sign contracts for the project prior to the prorogation of the Victorian Parliament early in November. It is in the best interest that this not proceed. The Labor opposition has repeatedly declared that the project is a dud project. Notwithstanding this, it says that if elected, the government will continue with contracts if they are signed. The ALP needs to have a hard look at itself and decide whether they are prepared to govern in the interest of the state or a select group of contractors. One of the excuses that are made to evade a commitment to drawing a line under the East-West Link project is that it could cause the price of public debt to increase. However, as Kenneth Davison rightly pointed out in the Age this week, the potential for the ratings agencies to do damage to Victorian public finances in the event that government debt is downgraded is relatively minor relative to the colossal costs that would be inflicted on the Victorian economy if this calamitous project is allowed to stumble on. On the face of it, it would be absurd if the credit rating were to decline in the event that the ALP government or the current Napthine government had the gumption to draw the line under the project, given the negative consequences for the economy. To my mind, it strengthens the belief that the credit agencies don't actually know what they're doing, as was reflected in the failure to predict the late 1990s Asian financial crisis, and also their failure to predict the accumulation of subprime debt which precipitated the GFC in the last decade. I want to say something briefly about the container port proposal in Hastings, which has been around for quite a while. The government says that it would assist to retain Melbourne's status as the freight and logistics hub of Australia. The Victorian opposition was quite keen on Hastings at one stage, but has now gone cold on the idea and is now directing attention to other locations. I understand that prior to the introduction of containerisation, the Port of Melbourne employed about 6,500 waterside workers in general freight and now employs about 200 people in the container terminals. So that's a fairly major loss of employment. So the direct employment benefits are fairly limited. Despite the fact that the political parties implicitly assert that the employment creating capacity of the new container port is sobering to realise that any new container port is likely to be heavily automated. So the employment is probably likely to go down even further. So labour replacing automation is increasingly common in the transport and materials handling industry. For example, Rio Tinto is going to run a 1,500 kilometre train track in the Pilbara with driverless trains to pull iron ore to the coast of Western Australia without a driver on any of these trains, and they're going to be run from Perth. So that's what's happening in the industry. Analysis completed recently by Victoria University suggests Hastings may not be a very bright idea for a container port for a number of reasons. And these include environmental concerns, the future of the Ramsar Convention protected wetlands in Hastings may also jeopardise local tourism-based industries, and the location is suboptimal having regard to the land-based distribution task once containers are landed, having in most cases to go to the northern and western suburbs where the major logistics operators are. I also want to briefly mention the Cranbourne Pakenham Rail project, which was also developed as a PPP by the government as an unsolicited bid earlier this year. It's interesting to note that the recently released drawings of the new stations to be grade separated on the Dandenong line don't show any provision for widening for extra rail freight capacity, even though the government is basically saying that they're going to have a rail connection to the new Port of Hastings. So either they don't know what they're doing, or they basically intend to put all that freight onto road. So, like the East-West Link process, the Cranbourne Corridor project is secret bids, secret processes, no costings, no business case worth a name. Another one of the Napperdine government's game-changing infrastructure projects. Including remark on road spending, the recent draft industry consultation document prepared in Infrastructure Australia, which was released to the press recently, noted that most of the economic infrastructure projects submitted in recent years to the Commonwealth for funding to be assessed by Infrastructure Australia were roads projects, and they lacked any cost-benefit rigour whatsoever. They say in part, quote, road project proponents spend next to no effort examining what problems their projects and plans are trying to solve, other than the perceived problem that they do not have enough road funding. In other words, the answer is almost always, I need more money, regardless of the question. The Victorian Auditor-General earlier this year also said that our road system in Victoria is operated inefficiently, in part because trams and buses are not currently able to provide accurate and reliable reference data to Vic Road's traffic signalling system, so that they can operate more speedily and more efficiently. I understand at the moment Vic Roads is only reviewing its signal data every 20 years, when they're supposed to do it every 5 years. Now, it's certainly the case that the East-West Link, the disaster, which Tony Abbott has been happy to turn over $3 billion in our hard-earned money for, which is basically the underlying message from the Infrastructure Australia report. No business case, no comparative analysis, no questions asked. It was the mentality also behind the Peninsula Link project, and now threatens in relation to Port Nepean road study, where Vic Roads hopes to take some more freeway onto Peninsula Link, effectively, and without any regard for more effective public and active transport solutions that don't contribute to the further environmental degradation of Frankston, the peninsula and surrounding areas, and keeping local residents poor through continuing car dependency. Thanks very much.
You'll see from the printed agenda that we're going to have an opportunity for community comments on issues that are Frankston related more broadly, but before we do that, there is an opportunity for people to ask questions or make comments related to the issues that Ian has raised. So anyone? Yep.
You mentioned the problems with the Port of Hastings Port. The alternative from the Labor government seems to be Bay West, which would entail blowing up more of the heads, allowing more water into the bay, and Frankston has suffered since the heads were widened a few years ago. We had our beach completely washed away last spring. Steps to the beach ended up being shoulder high, sticking out into the air. We've never had that. We've had the pier destroyed twice in the last 4 years, or the last 3 years, I think it is. Now, should all that, the bayside suburbs, particularly low-lying ones like Frankston, have to put up with this Bay West project, which Labor are, and if you, as you say, it only gives around 200 or 300 jobs, does it warrant it?
Yeah, I mean that's the question, I think. Does it warrant potential damage either in the Western Port Bay area or in Port Phillip Bay? We seem to be between a rock and a hard place in some respects. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, on the environmental issues to the degree that I can measure them. But, it seems that whichever way you go, there are going to be potential problems. I mean, it may be potential. I mean, one thing that Infrastructure Australia should be looking at, I guess, and they to advise on federal funding is the disposition of port capability in Australia as a whole.
I think it was in Kenneth Davis's article where he said, well, Melbourne shouldn't be knowing that Brisbane and Sydney is international.
Well, that's the sort of issue that Infrastructure Australia should be looking at. I mean, then I think also the Victoria University report refers to the fact that it might be sensible for the smaller container ships to come south and for the larger ones to drop off cargo further north, given the sailing time available, or the sailing time required. So that might be another clue as to how the problem might be dealt with without imposing the environmental damage on Melbourne and its environments, whether it be in Western Port Bay or Port Phillip Bay.
Yes, Peter Asco's my name. I'm probably a public transport person, infrastructure person. What concerns me about public transport debate is that it seems to be that public transport's the panacea of everything. One of the things that I haven't seen in any assessment is a life cycle analysis of the public transport system vis-a-vis the private system in terms of public cars. My observations, working and living in this area and outside this area occasionally, is our public transport system is not efficient for a range of reasons, and all roads and rail tends to lead to Melbourne. But we've got a lot of public transport that travels empty for a large part of the day. There's an urban design issue where people, you rightly said, need to be working close to work where they are. But I'd also mention that, again from my observations, that there needs to be a critical mass of probably about, and I'm using a carbon measurement per tonne here, doesn't matter how you source the energy, but it has to be, the analysis has to be that is the public transport system in its consumption of energy any better than the personal transport system? I would suspect that until a critical mass is achieved, it's not the case. And I don't know whether you've seen any work on that, because when you start analysing the cost of the public transport system and the amount of time it spends travelling empty, from my observations at Frankston, an analysis of the transport system here, you'd be better off paying taxes than actually having the bus services. I'll just throw that into a discussion, but the point I'm making is there has to be a critical mass before public transport can be viable.
I'll take the last comment first. The issue of patronage levels relates very strongly to frequency of service and span of service. With a well-designed bus system, for example, what you generally find is that if you increase frequency by a certain percentage, the actual patronage levels would go up more. That's generally what happens. I mean, the 903 Smart Bus, for example, which is one of the orbital services, got very high patronage levels. Runs every 15 minutes during the week, and that's where it attracts these very large patronage levels. But when you've got services that run every hour, as you do here, or even less than every hour, it's just not good enough for people to actually choose that as their preferred option. That would be my general comment. In relation to dispersed suburbs, for example, and the viability of public transport to actually service suburbs with relatively low density populations, I think the work that the late Paul Mees did and his observations about relatively dispersed cities overseas that had very good public transport systems, but in the context of relatively dispersed populations, is something that we can draw some comfort from in that regard. I mean, it's generally true that I guess that certainly with the bus system that they're relatively underutilised, or a lot of the services are underutilised during the middle of the day. That has partly to do with the low frequencies I'm talking about. It's just not going to suit people's purpose if the thing's running every hour or every half hour, and that makes their return journey particularly long. So there's the time cost involved with that. In terms of the pollution impact, I mean, there was some work done by the EPA which basically showed the relative pollution impacts of public transport versus the private car, and PT came out well in front. But I take the point about you need the higher occupancy levels. But I mean, if you look at the private car, for example, around Melbourne, basically in peak, we've got 1.1 persons in each private car that's on freeways, jamming up freeways. And consider the mass of that. It's incredibly inefficient, and it's also very polluting. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
I'd just like to jump back to the previous question regarding setting up container ports at Hastings. Several decades ago, my husband and I ran Melbourne's largest container depot for repairs for both dry and refrigerated containers in Port Melbourne. We had just on 200 employees and we were going gangbusters. When we saw that Melbourne was going to reach a capacity for being able to deal with containers, we ourselves started to look at other viable ports, and a lengthy study we did showed that the ideal port for receiving ships and shipping containers was Portland. It was a natural deep water port. It wasn't going to, as far as we could find out, create more environmental problems. It was on the right side of Victoria, say the industrial side of Victoria. It would have required perhaps a train service to carry containers and infrastructure, but we had NYK Line interested in coming in with us, and we proceeded to try and approach various government ministers, but we just hit shut doors all the time. So we sat around and watched what was happening to shipping and containers and ports and everything. When the idea of Hastings was suggested, I must say I reeled back in horror, because having in the meantime squeezed in a degree in environmental geography, I realised Hastings was a fairly shallow area. It had a lot of seagrasses, a lot of fish nurseries there, and can you imagine what would happen to particularly heavy transport, road access down on the peninsula? It would have been a nightmare. I have, with all the closures in Geelong of the various companies and so many people put out of work, I tried to contact, as an ex-councillor in the city of Brighton before amalgamation, I tried to contact the mayor of Geelong, a colourful character. Once again, doors shut in my face. It just seems to me that there is no logic in the planning that's going on. I disagree a little bit with you. I know that ports have become very mechanised, but in the ancillary industries that we were in, you still need welders and boilermakers and refrigeration mechanics. And I would encourage you or anybody who will listen to you to keep putting Portland up, because then you will not need to get... I'm a former, I was in the Swedish Merchant Navy for 5 years, so I'm an old sailor. My husband's a Swedish marine engineer and he was at sea for nearly 20 years. So we know it from both sides, and we feel that there is a future in Victoria for shipping and containers, but you've got to stay out of Port Phillip Bay and you've got to stay out of Hastings, out of Western Port Bay.
I want to do a couple more before we move on. I think, Sean, you have something you want to say?
Oh, yeah, just quickly, thanks for that. You might know, having said that the ALP's gone cold on the Hastings option, that they've now last got a candidate for Hastings who's come out on the front page of the Westport News saying that in fact he does support it. So it'll be interesting to see how Natalie Hutchins, who's the shadow port minister, who said she's going to campaign against the Hastings port, she might have to campaign for someone in the electorate who's against the port expansion, against her own candidate.
All right, one more, Sheila.
Hi, thanks for your talk. What you're describing is a kind of turnstile economy where people are promoting infrastructure that they can sell tickets on and get more and more customers using. And you've given us examples of secrecy in engineering that economy, like you can't find out how many people are actually using the toll roads and so on. I just think you've made very clear the link between democracy and population growth via the engineering of transport, and I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to that democracy is very much at issue here. And also the design of transport is obviously being engineered to benefit private individuals who own the infrastructure and can charge for it. And I also noted the gentleman over there who was talking about the cost of public transport. We talk about the cost of public transport in terms of profit or cost to the government or to the people providing it, but what we forget is the cost of not having public transport for the community. I mean, the government is there to serve the community. And you also, you did a really good description of public transport in Frankston, but you didn't mention, for instance, that a lot of services aren't available on Sundays or after 5 or 6 p.m. Which basically maroons older people. If you look at the demographics of Frankston, there are a lot of older people and poor people who simply don't have the means to get about unless there's a bus, and there are very few buses. Thanks.
I'm very, very aware of the span of service problem in Frankston and on the peninsula, and particularly on weekends and public holidays. It's true a lot about Melbourne. I mean, it's true in the north and in the west as well. The transparency issue, I think, yeah, absolutely. We've got a major problem there. The way projects are now procured, and the fact that information that previously had been on the public record is now refused, and it's being refused because we've got contractual provisions being written by previous governments that actually make it impossible to find out, as I did.
All right, we might make very much for your contribution, Ian. The issue in relation to ports, Jenny, you might put your hand up, is sitting down the front, is associated with Blue Wedges and has considerable expertise in relation to ports, addressed the Sustainable Population Australia Victoria branch AGM recently on this topic, and there was some discussion about the capacity of natural deep water ports up north to take the super container ships and offload them onto smaller ships for which Melbourne's existing port capacity is sufficient. But people who want to follow that issue might be interested in talking with Jenny, and I was very interested to hear Anne's points about the Stony Point line, which I wasn't particularly familiar with, because there's no doubt if you've got infrequent service, people won't use it because they're afraid of long waits. So you need to do something about that to improve its viability. But